The morning sun streamed through the windows of Precision Cut's barbershop in downtown Prague, casting long shadows across the checkered floor where Aspen Roberts swept away yesterday's hair clippings. At 23, with calloused hands that moved with surgical precision around scissors and razors, she was known throughout the neighborhood as the quiet girl who could give you the perfect fade and never said much about herself. But what the locals didn't know, what nobody could have possibly imagined, was that those same steady hands could disassemble and reassemble a military-grade assault rifle faster than most trained soldiers, in 5 seconds flat, to be exact. Today, that impossible skill would turn a routine morning into a moment that would change everything. Anyone thought they knew about the unassuming barber who had been hiding in plain sight for 2 years. The Vinohrady district of Prague hummed with its usual Tuesday morning rhythm. Trams clanged along the tree-lined streets, cafe owners hosed down their sidewalk seating areas, and the early commuters hurried past shop windows still catching the first golden rays of what promised to be a beautiful sunny day. Precision Cut's barbershop sat wedged between a vintage bookstore and a small electronics repair shop, its red and white striped poles spinning lazily in the morning light. The shop had been there for 30 years, owned by old Victor Novak until he retired and left it to his nephew's management. But for the past 2 years, it really had been Aspen Roberts' domain. She'd arrived in Prague speaking broken Czech and carrying nothing but a weathered duffel bag and a letter of recommendation from a barber in Berlin. Her story, at least the one she told, was simple. A young woman from somewhere in the Balkans looking for a fresh start, willing to work hard and learn the trade. Victor's nephew, Martin, had been skeptical at first. The shop served a predominantly male clientele. Blue-collar workers, older gentlemen, the occasional businessman who preferred the old-school approach to grooming. But Aspen had a way with the clippers that bordered on artistic. Her cuts were precise, her straight razor work was flawless, and she had an uncanny ability to know exactly what a customer wanted even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. Within 6 months, she had her own regular customers. Within a year, she was generating more revenue than Martin had seen since his uncle's prime. The neighborhood embraced her gradually, the way small communities do with quiet competence. Mrs. Swoboda from the bakery next door would bring her fresh kolache on slow afternoons. The mechanics from the garage down the street became regulars, trusting her with their weekend grooming before nights out. Even the local police officers would stop by for quick trims between shifts. To everyone who knew her, Aspen Roberts was simply the efficient young barber who opened the shop at 7 sharp every morning, who could make conversation about football and weather in her softly accented Czech, and who never talked much about her past. She lived in a small flat above a laundromat 3 blocks away, rode an old bicycle to work, and spent her evenings reading in the local park or walking along the Vltava River. But there were details that people noticed without really seeing them. The way her eyes automatically tracked movement on the street outside the shop windows. How she always positioned herself so she could see both the front door and the back exit. The way she kept her workspace impossibly organized, every tool in its exact place, every surface clean and ready for immediate use. There was also her precision with tools that went beyond normal barbering skill. When the ancient cash register broke down, she had it repaired and functioning within 20 minutes, her fingers moving over the mechanical components like a pianist over keys. When Martin's motorcycle wouldn't start, she diagnosed and fixed the electrical problem faster than the mechanic he'd planned to call. "You have clever hands," Mrs. Swoboda had observed one afternoon, watching Aspen repair the coffee machine that had been giving them trouble for weeks. "What did you do before cutting hair?" Aspen had smiled that quiet smile she wore like armor. "A little bit of everything," she'd said. "You learn things when you grow up without much money. You learn to fix what breaks, because replacing it isn't an option." It was a reasonable answer, the kind that satisfied casual curiosity without revealing anything substantial. Most people in the neighborhood had their own stories of hardship and reinvention, their own reasons for not dwelling too deeply on the past. Prague was full of people who'd started over, and Aspen Roberts fit in right in. The shop itself had become her sanctuary of routine and predictability. Every morning at 6:30, she would unlock the front door, flip the sign from Zavreno to Otevřeno, and begin her preparation ritual. Tools cleaned and arranged, mirrors spotless, the old radio tuned to the classical station that provided a peaceful backdrop to the day's work. By 7 o'clock, the first customers would begin arriving. Usually Jan, the construction foreman, who needed a quick trim before heading to his job site. Then Pavel, the university professor who preferred his hair cut early to avoid the crowds. By 8 o'clock, the shop would settle into its comfortable rhythm of conversation and the methodical snip of scissors. This morning had started no differently. The sun painted warm squares of light across the checkered linoleum floor. The radio played a soft piano concerto, and Aspen moved through her opening routine with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. Just another sunny Tuesday in a life built on careful normalcy. She had no way of knowing that in less than 3 hours, that carefully constructed normal life would shatter completely. Aspen Roberts moved through the morning routine with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd performed the same motions hundreds of times. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the same uniform she always did. Black jeans, a crisp white button-down shirt, and comfortable leather shoes that wouldn't slip on hair-covered floors. At first glance, she appeared unremarkable. Average height, slender build, with the kind of understated presence that made her blend into crowds. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a subtle alertness, an economy of movement that suggested depths beneath the surface. Her green eyes missed nothing, tracking the movement of pedestrians outside, cataloging the sounds of the awakening neighborhood, always aware of her surroundings in a way that went beyond normal caution. The customers who came to know her best might have noticed other things, how her hands never shook, not even after her 4th cup of coffee, how she could carry on a conversation while working, but her eyes would occasionally drift to the mirrors in a pattern that let her monitor every angle of the shop, how she knew the sound of every regular customer's footstep before they reached the door. "Nobody den, Aspen?" called Jan as he pushed through the front door, bringing with him the smell of morning cigarettes and construction dust. At 52, he was built like a bull and had the temperament to match when things didn't go his way. But he'd been coming to Aspen for 18 months, and she'd never once given him reason for complaint. "Nobody then, Jan," she replied, already moving to prepare his chair. "The usual?" "Always the usual." He settled into the worn leather chair with a grunt of satisfaction. Jan was a creature of habit, and that suited Aspen perfectly. Predictability was comfortable. Predictability was safe. As she worked, Jan talked about his current construction project, a new office building near Wenceslaus Square that was running behind schedule due to permit delays. Aspen listened with the part of her mind that had learned to engage in these morning conversations, while another part remained constantly alert to the environment around them. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, trimming exactly 3 millimeters off the sides, blending the cut with techniques she'd perfected through thousands of hours of practice. But these weren't the only hand skills she'd perfected. Late at night, in the privacy of her small apartment, she maintained very different kinds of practice routines. "You're quiet today," Jan observed, watching her work in the mirror. "Everything okay?" Aspen realized she'd been more withdrawn than usual, lost in thoughts she couldn't share. "Just tired," she said. "Stayed up too late reading." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had stayed up late, but she hadn't been reading novels or newspapers. She'd been reviewing technical manuals, studying schematics, keeping skills sharp that she'd hoped she'd never need to use again. Skills that came from a life she'd left behind when she arrived in Prague with nothing but a duffel bag and a desperate need to disappear. Her real name wasn't Aspen Roberts. She'd been born Aspen Roberts in a village outside Sarajevo, the daughter of a gunsmith who taught her to field strip weapons before she could properly tie her shoes. By the time she was 15, she could repair or modify virtually any small arms weapon manufactured in the past 50 years. By 18, she was faster at weapon assembly than most military instructors. But that was a lifetime ago. Before the War Crimes Tribunal, before her father was arrested, and before she'd been forced to flee with evidence that could destroy powerful people who wanted her silenced. The quiet barber in Prague is who she'd become to survive. The weapons expert is who she'd been born to be. The transformation hadn't been easy. She'd spent months learning to suppress the hypervigilance that had kept her alive during 3 years of hiding. She'd taught herself to make small talk, to smile at customers, to project the kind of unremarkable competence that made people comfortable. She'd built an entire personality designed to be forgettable. Most days, she almost believed in the life she'd created, almost believed that Aspen Roberts, neighborhood barber, was real, and Aspen Roberts, daughter of an accused war criminal, was just a bad dream from long ago. "There you go," she said, brushing the loose hair from Jan's neck and removing the cape. "Perfect as always." Jan stood and examined himself in the mirror, running a hand over his fresh cut with satisfaction. He left his usual tip and headed out to his construction site, calling a cheerful goodbye over his shoulder. Aspen cleaned her station and prepared for the next customer, settling back into the comfortable rhythm of her assumed life. The radio played a gentle waltz, the morning sun continued to stream through the windows, and everything felt normal and safe. She had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed world was about to collide with the violent past she'd spent 2 years trying to escape. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The comfortable morning rhythm of Aspen was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Tomasz Krejci from the local police station. Unlike her regular customers who came for grooming, Krejci's visits always carried an undercurrent of professional scrutiny that made Aspen's muscles tense despite her outward calm. "Dobry den, Aspen," Krejci said, settling into the chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. At 45, he was a career cop with sharp eyes and an instinct for spotting things that didn't quite fit. He'd been coming to the shop for 6 months, ostensibly for haircuts, but Aspen suspected his visit served a dual purpose. "The usual trim, Detective?" she asked, wrapping the cape around his shoulders with practiced efficiency. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something," Krejci said, watching her reflection in the mirror. "We've been having some issues in the neighborhood lately. Break-ins, vandalism, the kind of thing that makes business owners nervous." Aspen's hands continued their steady work, but her attention sharpened. "I haven't noticed anything unusual. The neighborhood seems quiet to me." "That's just it," Krejci replied. "You notice things. Martin mentioned that you spotted those teenagers trying to break into the electronics shop last month before anyone else saw them. You seem very aware of your surroundings." The compliment felt like a trap. Aspen had indeed noticed the attempted break-in, but only because her training had taught her to catalog every person who lingered too long near potential targets. She'd called it in anonymously, not wanting to draw attention to herself. "I suppose when you work alone, you learn to pay attention. It's just common sense." Krejci nodded thoughtfully. "Common sense, sure, but most barbers don't notice as much as you do. Most people, period, don't have that kind of situational awareness. Makes me wonder where you developed it." The question hung in the air like smoke. Aspen continued cutting, her movements betraying none of the tension building in her chest. This was exactly the kind of attention she'd spent 2 years trying to avoid. "Growing up in a rough area teaches you things," she said, falling back on the vague backstory she'd constructed. "You learn to watch out for trouble." Which rough area was that, exactly? Creechy's tone remained conversational, but Aspen caught the subtle shift. This wasn't idle curiosity anymore. This was an interrogation disguised as a haircut. "Sarajevo," she replied, sticking to the elements of truth that made lies easier to maintain. "I've been to Sarajevo," Creechy said casually. "Beautiful city, terrible history. What part did you live in?" Aspen's hand paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming its steady rhythm. She'd prepared for questions like this, had studied maps and local knowledge in case anyone ever pressed for details. But hearing them from a trained investigator felt different than rehearsing answers in her apartment. "Grbavica," she said, "near the river." "Ah, yes, lots of damage there during the siege." Creechy was quiet for a moment, then continued. "You know, I have a friend in Interpol. Interesting work they do, tracking people across borders, especially people who might be running from something." The threat was delicate, but unmistakable. Aspen felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept her alive during 3 years of running, but she forced her breathing to remain steady. In the mirror, she watched Creechy watching her, looking for tells, for cracks in the facade she'd built. "I can't imagine why anyone would run from something if they hadn't done anything wrong," she said evenly. "Oh, people run for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they're guilty of crimes. Sometimes they're witnesses to things powerful people don't want exposed. Sometimes they're just afraid of being blamed for their family's actions." The last comment hit like a physical blow. Aspen's father had been arrested for war crimes, accused of supplying weapons to paramilitary groups that had committed atrocities. She'd never known if the charges were true, but she'd known that association was enough to make her a target for both justice and revenge. "I'm sure that must be difficult for people in those situations," she managed. "I imagine it would be," Creechy agreed. "Living under a false identity, always looking over your shoulder, never able to form real relationships because you're constantly hiding who you really are. That's not much of a life, is it?" Aspen finished the haircut in silence, her mind racing through contingencies she'd hoped never to need. Creechy's questions weren't random. He suspected something, though she couldn't tell how much he actually knew versus how much he was fishing for information. As she brushed the loose hair from his neck and removed the cape, Creechy stood and turned to face her directly. "Aspen," he said, using her false name with deliberate emphasis, "if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need help, or where you might have information that could help others, I hope you know you can trust me." After he left, Aspen stood alone in the shop, her hands trembling slightly for the first time in months. Her carefully constructed, safe life was beginning to crumble, and she could feel the weight of her hidden past pressing against the barriers she'd built to contain it. Over the following weeks, Aspen began to notice the subtle ways her world was shrinking. The changes started small. Conversations that stopped when she entered the local cafe. Customers who suddenly found excuses to cancel their appointments. The way Mrs. Svoboda's warm greetings became polite but distant. Detective Crakey's visit had apparently been just the beginning. She spotted plainclothes officers conducting what appeared to be casual conversations with her neighbors and regular customers. Martin, who owned the barbershop, began showing up more frequently, claiming he wanted to check on business, but clearly uncomfortable in her presence. "The revenue has been down this month," Martin said one Tuesday afternoon, fidgeting with the old cash register she'd repaired. "Maybe we should think about adjusting your hours." Aspen looked up from cleaning her scissors, Noting the way he avoided eye contact, "Down by how much?" "Well, not exactly down," Martin admitted, "but some customers have mentioned they might try that new salon near the square. More modern, they said." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her appointment book was still full, her regular customers still came in at exactly on schedule, and she'd seen the daily receipts. But the pressure was building from sources Martin couldn't openly acknowledge. The isolation became more pronounced when she tried to join the Neighborhood Merchants Association. She'd been invited to their monthly meetings for a year, but had always declined, preferring to maintain her low profile. Now, sensing that community connections might offer some protection, she decided to attend. The meeting was held in the back room of Dvorak's restaurant, where local business owners gathered to discuss common concerns about foot traffic, city regulations, and seasonal promotions. Aspen arrived exactly on time, carrying a plate of homemade cookies as a peace offering. The conversation stopped when she walked in. "Ah, Aspen," said Viktor Svoboda, Mrs. Svoboda's husband, who ran the electronics repair shop. "We weren't expecting you." "Martin mentioned the meeting," she replied, setting down the cookies and taking an empty chair near the back. "I thought it might be time to get more involved in the community." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Helena Novotna, who owned the vintage bookstore, spoke up. "That's nice of you to want to participate, though I have to say, some of us have been wondering about your background." "My background?" "Well, you've been here 2 years, but we don't really know much about you. In a close neighborhood like this, people like to know who they're doing business with." "I cut hair," Aspen said simply. "I pay my rent, I don't cause trouble. What else do you need to know?" "It's not about causing trouble," Helena replied. "It's about trust, about being part of a community where people look out for each other. That's hard to do when someone is secretive." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Around the table, faces that had been friendly for months now looked at her with suspicion and uncertainty. These were people who'd bought her coffee when she worked late, who'd invited her to local festivals, who'd welcomed her into their daily routines. Now, they were studying her like a problem to be solved. "I understand privacy," František said, the owner of the small grocery store. "We all have things we don't discuss, but lately there have been questions about you from people in positions of authority. That makes us nervous." "What kind of questions?" Aspen asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Police questions," Viktor said bluntly. "Questions about where you came from, what you did before you got here, whether your papers are legitimate. When police start asking questions about someone in our neighborhood, it affects all of us." The meeting continued for another hour, but Aspen's participation was minimal. She listened to discussions about summer festivals and holiday decorations while feeling increasingly like an outsider looking in on a world she'd briefly thought she could be part of. When the meeting ended, she gathered her untouched cookies and prepared to leave. Helena approached her near the door. "Aspen, I don't know what's going on with you, but I hope you understand that we're just trying to protect what we've built here. This is a good neighborhood with good people. We can't afford to have problems." "I haven't caused any problems." "Maybe not yet, but people with secrets usually do, eventually." Walking back to her apartment that evening, Aspen felt the weight of isolation settling around her like a familiar coat. She'd experienced this before, in other cities and other identities, the gradual erosion of trust that preceded the need to run again. The difference was that this time she'd allowed herself to hope it might be different, She'd let herself believe that Aspen Roberts could be real, that the quiet barber could have a normal life in a peaceful neighborhood. Now she realized how naive that hope had been. People with her kind of past didn't get normal lives. They got temporary refuges between the storms. As the walls of suspicion closed around her, Aspen retreated into the discipline that had kept her alive for years. If her carefully constructed normal life was under threat, she needed to ensure her survival skills remained sharp. Every night after closing the barbershop, she would return to her small apartment and transform from neighborhood barber into something far more dangerous. Her flat above the laundromat was spartanly furnished but efficiently organized. What appeared to casual observation as simple furniture served multiple purposes. The coffee table opened to reveal communication equipment and false documents. The bedroom dresser had a hidden compartment containing currency from 6 different countries. The bathroom mirror concealed a first aid kit that went far beyond treating shaving nicks. But it was the space beneath the loose floorboards under her bed that contained the tools of her real trade. Every few nights, when the building was quiet and the laundromat below had closed, Aspen would carefully lift the boards and retrieve the components she'd gradually acquired over 2 years in Prague. Not complete weapons, those would have been impossible to obtain without drawing attention, but parts, pieces, components that appeared innocent individually but could be assembled into something lethal in the right hands. Her hands had always been the right hands. Tonight, as rain drummed against her small window, she spread the components across a towel on her kitchen table. A disassembled AK-74 variant, its parts meticulously maintained and oiled despite never being assembled in her apartment before. She'd acquired the pieces slowly, carefully, from different sources across the city. A firing pin from a collector who thought she was interested in historical artifacts. A barrel from a theatrical props master who assumed she was working on a war movie. Springs and screws from various machine shops where her knowledge of metallurgy had earned her respect and no questions. Closing her eyes, Aspen let her muscle memory take over. Her fingers found each component without looking, assembling the weapon with the same fluid precision she brought to cutting hair. Stock attached, bolt carrier group inserted, trigger mechanism engaged. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see her father's workshop, could hear his voice guiding her through the process when she was barely tall enough to see over the workbench. Precision, Aspodisia. Speed without precision is chaos. Precision without speed is death. Find the balance. The weapon clicked into place with the satisfying mechanical precision that had always calmed her mind. She opened her eyes and checked the timer on her phone. 4.8 seconds. Still faster than most military instructors, but slower than her personal best. She'd need to practice more. Aspen disassembled the rifle just as quickly, her movements economical and sure. Each component was cleaned again, checked for wear, and returned to its hiding place. The floorboards went back exactly as they'd been, with the small scratches and wear patterns that made them appear undisturbed. But weapons weren't her only preparation. In the weeks since Detective Krejci's visit, she'd also been updating her escape plans. She memorized bus and train schedules, noted which routes had the least security monitoring, identified border crossings that might be crossed on foot if necessary. She'd already established contact with a forger in Vienna who could provide new documents within 72 hours if she could reach him. Her emergency bag was packed and hidden in the laundromat storage room below, accessible through a maintenance window she'd quietly modified months ago. Cash, documents, basic supplies, and a change of clothes that would help her blend into a dozen different environments. Yet even as she made these preparations, part of her rebelled against the necessity. She'd built something in Prague, something that felt almost like belonging. Her customers trusted her with more than their hair. They shared their problems, their family stories, their small triumphs and disappointments. Mrs. Svoboda still smiled when she passed the barbershop, despite the cooling attitudes of others. Old Pavel still came in for his weekly trim and their discussions of Czech literature. Some evenings, she would sit by her window and watch the life of the neighborhood unfold below. Children playing in the courtyard, couples walking hand in hand toward the nearby restaurants, elderly residents gathering on benches to discuss the day's events. It was a life she'd never had, a stability she'd never known, and losing it felt like losing something essential to her soul. But survival trumped sentiment, as it always had. If Detective Krejci was building a case against her, if Interpol was involved, if her father's enemies had finally tracked her to Prague, then all the belonging in the world wouldn't protect her from the consequences. Late that night, as she prepared for bed, Aspen allowed herself one moment of weakness. She pulled out a photograph she'd kept hidden since arriving in Prague. Her father in his workshop, smiling as he showed 15-year-old Aspodija how to adjust a trigger mechanism. Before the war, before the accusations, before everything went wrong. Tomorrow, she would continue being the quiet neighborhood barber. But tonight, she prepared for the possibility that Aspen Roberts might have to die so that Aspodija Radovich could live long enough to run again.
The whispers started on a Thursday morning, when Aspen arrived to find a small crowd gathered outside the electronics repair shop next door. Victor Svoboda stood in animated conversation with two men in dark suits who were clearly not locals. Their shoes were too expensive, their posture too alert, and they carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Aspen unlocked her barbershop and began her morning routine, but her attention remained fixed on the conversation happening just meters away. Through years of practice, she'd learned to appear absorbed in mundane tasks while actually focused on gathering intelligence about potential threats. Asking about backgrounds, employment history, that sort of thing, Victor was saying, his voice carrying the nervous edge of someone unaccustomed to official scrutiny. I told them I don't really know much about her personal life. She keeps to herself, you know? But you've observed her behavior patterns, one of the suited men asked. Any inconsistencies in her story? Skills that seem unusual for her supposed background? Aspen's hand tightened on the broom handle as she swept the same section of floor for the third time. They were building a profile, collecting observations from multiple sources to create a comprehensive picture of her life in Prague. It was textbook intelligence gathering, and it meant they already suspected who she really was. Well, Victor said reluctantly, she does seem to know a lot about mechanical things. Fixed our cash register when the repair service couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And she's very observant. Always seems to notice things before other people do. What kind of things? The second man pressed. Little things. People who don't belong in the neighborhood. Unusual activity. Potential problems. She spotted those teenagers trying to break into our shop last month before anyone else saw them. And when that drunk tourist got lost and was wandering around at night, she was the one who called it in. The men exchanged glances that Aspen caught in her peripheral vision. Her hypervigilance, which she'd tried so hard to suppress, was being documented as evidence of suspicious behavior. The very instincts that had kept her alive were now marking her as a person of interest. After the men left, Victor approached her shop. His usual friendly demeanor had been replaced by obvious discomfort and a wariness that hadn't been there the day before. "Morning, Aspen," he said, hovering near her doorway rather than entering as he normally would. "Busy morning already." "So I noticed," she replied, not looking up from arranging her tools. "Everything all right?" "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes authorities ask questions about the neighborhood. Just routine stuff, making sure everyone's properly documented." He paused, then added with forced casualness, "You do have all your papers in order, don't you? Work permits, residency documents, that sort of thing?" The question was clearly prompted by his conversation with the investigators, and both of them knew it. Aspen finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Of course I do, Victor. Martin wouldn't have hired me without proper documentation." Right. Of course. It's just that in today's world, you can't be too careful. Identity theft, forged documents, people claiming to be someone they're not. It happens more than you'd think." The accusation was subtle but unmistakable. Victor, who'd welcomed her into the neighborhood, who'd shared coffee and conversation during slow afternoons, was now questioning the fundamental truth of her identity. "I imagine it would be very difficult to maintain a false identity for 2 years," Aspen said carefully. "The constant stress of pretending to be someone else, always worrying about being discovered. That would take a particular kind of person." "Yes," Victor agreed. "Someone with specialized training. Someone who'd had practice living under assumed names." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Kratochvilova, one of Aspen's regular customers. But instead of entering the shop, the elderly woman approached Victor with obvious agitation. "Victor, I need to ask you something. My grandson works in immigration services, and he mentioned they've been getting inquiries about someone in our neighborhood, someone who might not be who they claim to be." Aspen continued her preparation ritual, but every muscle in her body was tense. The net was closing faster than she'd anticipated. "What kind of inquiries?" Victor asked. "International ones, from countries that had problems during the wars in the Balkans. They're looking for someone who might have been involved with weapons trafficking, someone whose family had connections to war crimes." The words hit Aspen like physical blows. Her father's case was being used to hunt her down, decades later and hundreds of miles from where those events had occurred. The sins of the father visited upon the daughter who'd spent years trying to escape that legacy. "Did your grandson mention any names?" Victor asked. Mrs. Kratochvilova glanced meaningfully toward Aspen's shop. "Not specifically, but they said they were looking for a young woman, someone who would have specialized knowledge about firearms and military equipment, someone who might be working in a job that didn't match her real qualifications." As the two neighbors continued their conversation, Aspen realized that her time in Prague was coming to an end. The careful investigation was building towards some kind of action, and she couldn't afford to wait around to discover what that action might be. That evening, she began making final preparations for departure, even as part of her hoped desperately that she was overreacting to coincidences and neighborhood gossip. The confrontation Aspen had been dreading came on a Friday afternoon, just as she was finishing with her last customer of the day. Detective Krejci entered the shop, accompanied by 2 plainclothes officers she recognized from their earlier surveillance of the neighborhood. This time, there was no pretense of a social visit. "Aspodia Radovic," Krejci said, using her real name like a weapon. "Or should I continue calling you Aspen Roberts?" Her customer, an elderly gentleman named František, looked between them with growing alarm. Aspen's hands remained steady as she finished his trim, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I'm sorry, František," she said calmly, removing the cape and brushing loose hair from his collar. "We need to finish a bit early today." František fumbled for his wallet, clearly sensing the tension in the room.
One of the plainclothes officers stepped forward. "Sir, you need to leave now. This is official business." After František hurried out, shooting worried glances over his shoulder, Krejci closed the shop door, then turned the sign to Savženo. The sound of the lock engaging felt like a prison door slamming shut. "Ms. Radovic," Krejci began, settling into the barber chair with deliberate casualness, "we need to have a conversation about your father, about why you're really in Prague, and about what you've been doing for the past 2 years." Aspen continued cleaning her tools, buying time while her mind raced through options. The shop had no rear exit, the windows were too small to escape through, and 3 trained officers blocked her only way out. "I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Aspen Roberts. I'm a barber. I've been here legally for 2 years." "Your father was Miloš Radovic, arrested in 2019 for supplying weapons to paramilitary groups during the Bosnian conflict. He died in custody before trial, but not before implicating several high-ranking officials in weapons trafficking schemes." The words hung in the air like smoke. Aspen had known this day would come eventually, but hearing her father's story reduced to cold facts still felt like a physical blow. "Before his death," Krejci pressed on, "your father claimed he had given crucial evidence to his daughter, evidence that could expose the entire network. That daughter disappeared from Sarajevo 3 days before our colleagues arrived to question her. I don't know anything about evidence or networks. I just cut hair." One of the plainclothes officers, a woman with sharp features and calculating eyes, spoke for the first time. "Ms. Radovic, I'm Agent Mueller from Europol. We've been tracking you for 18 months. We know about your time in Berlin, your 6 months in Vienna, and your eventual arrival here in Prague. We know you've been using forged documents and false identities. More importantly," Krejci added, "we know about your technical expertise with weapons. Your neighbors have been very informative about your mechanical skills, your unusual knowledge, your suspicious behavior patterns." The trap was closing exactly as Aspen had feared. Her attempts to blend in, to be helpful and competent, had instead marked her as suspicious. Her father's training, the skills that had kept her alive, were now evidence of criminal association. "Ms. Radovic," Agent Mueller continued, "we're not here to arrest you. We're here to make you an offer." This was unexpected. Aspen looked up from her tools for the first time since the confrontation began. "The evidence your father claimed to possess could help us dismantle a weapons trafficking network that's been operating across Eastern Europe for over a decade. If you cooperate with our investigation, provide the information your father gave you, we can offer protection and a legitimate new identity." "And if I don't?" Aspen asked. Krejci's smile was cold. "Then we arrest you for immigration fraud, forged documents, and obstruction of justice. Your refugee status claim was based on false information. You'll be deported back to Bosnia, where there are people very interested in finding Miloš Radovic's daughter." The threat was clear. Cooperate or face the enemies her father had made, the people who'd killed him to silence his testimony. Either way, Aspen Roberts was finished. "You have 24 hours to decide," Mueller said, standing and straightening her jacket. "Tomorrow, at this time, you either help us with our investigation or you face the consequences of 2 years of illegal residence in the Czech Republic." "Where exactly do you suggest I go to think about this offer?" Aspen asked, noting how they'd positioned themselves to control all exits. "You will remain in your apartment," Krejci replied. "Under observation, of course. for your own protection as much as ours. The people your father betrayed have long memories and international reach." After they left, Aspen stood alone in her shop, surrounded by the tools and routines that had defined her life for 2 years. The mirrors reflected back multiple images of a woman whose carefully constructed identity had just been stripped away. Outside, she could see neighbors watching from their windows, their faces filled with the mixture of fear and curiosity that followed official police business. By tomorrow, everyone would know that the quiet barber was something else entirely. As she locked up the shop for what she suspected might be the last time, Aspen realized that all her preparation, all her careful planning had led to this moment of impossible choice. Betray her father's trust or lose everything she'd built. Help the authorities or face enemies who'd already killed once to protect their secrets. Either way, the life of Aspen Roberts was finished.
Aspen barely slept that night, knowing that surveillance teams were watching her building from multiple angles. Every sound in the hallway, every car engine on the street below, could signal the arrival of either law enforcement or the kind of people who'd preferred to resolve problems permanently. She'd spent the dark hours making preparations for multiple scenarios, but as dawn broke over Prague, she realized that all her planning might be irrelevant. The choice Muller and Kratky had given her was no choice at all. Cooperate and spend her life looking over her shoulder as a witness in hiding, or refuse and face immediate deportation to enemies who'd kill her for what her father had told her. The crisis arrived at 8:47 a.m., just as Aspen was considering whether to open the barbershop for what might be her final day of normal life. The first explosion shattered the morning quiet like thunder. From her apartment window, she could see smoke rising from the direction of the electronics repair shop. Car alarms were screaming, and people were running from the direction of the blast. Her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Terrorist incident in Vinorady district. Residents advised to shelter in place. But Aspen's training told her this wasn't random terrorism. This was targeted elimination, designed to look like collateral damage from a broader attack. Her suspicions were confirmed when she spotted movement in the building across the street. A sniper scope glinted in a third-floor window, positioned perfectly to cover her apartment and the barbershop below. These weren't law enforcement officers preparing for her morning decision. These were the people her father had betrayed, the ones who'd already killed him, and were now here to finish the job. Her phone rang. Kratky's number. "Aspen, we have a situation." His voice was tight with urgency. "Armed individuals have been spotted in your area. This might be connected to your father's case. We're sending units to extract you immediately." "How long until they arrive?" she asked, watching the sniper adjust his position. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Can you get to a secure location?" Aspen calculated angles, distance, timing. The sniper had her apartment covered, but the barbershop below offered different sightlines. If she could reach the shop, she might have options the assassins hadn't accounted for. "I'm moving to the shop," she said. "It's more defensible." "Negative. Stay where you are. Don't make yourself a target." But Aspen was already moving. Her emergency bag was in the laundromat below, but more importantly, she'd hidden additional resources in the barbershop itself, resources that no one, including the police, knew about. The stairwell was empty as she made her way down, but she could hear vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Through the laundromat's front window, she spotted armed figures moving between buildings, coordinating an assault that would eliminate her before Kratky's units could arrive. The barbershop felt different as she unlocked it, transformed from a place of routine comfort into a potential battlefield. She moved quickly to the supply closet in the back, where maintenance items concealed something far more dangerous. Hidden behind cleaning supplies and spare towels, wrapped in waterproof material, were the weapon components she'd been unable to keep in her apartment. Not just the AK-74 parts, but additional items she'd acquired for exactly this kind of emergency. Ammunition, tactical equipment, and most importantly, a complete combat kit that could transform the neighborhood barber into someone far more dangerous. Outside, she could hear vehicles stopping, doors slamming, voices coordinating in a language that wasn't Czech. Her father's enemies had found her, and they'd come prepared for war. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number.
"Give us the files your father left you, and this ends quickly." Another message followed immediately. "Refuse, and everyone in this neighborhood becomes collateral damage." Through the shop window, she could see Mrs. Svoboda's bakery, where the elderly woman was probably preparing her morning bread. František's grocery store, where he'd be arranging his produce display. Pavel's apartment building, where families were probably having breakfast, unaware that their quiet neighborhood had become a battleground. These people had slowly grown suspicious of her, had questioned her presence in their community, but they'd also welcomed her, supported her business, become part of the only normal life she'd ever known. Now they were hostages in a conflict they didn't understand, threatened because she'd tried to hide among them. Aspen's hands moved automatically, assembling the rifle with mechanical precision, even as her mind processed the impossible situation. She could surrender, hope that the assassins would honor their word about civilian casualties, and probably die within minutes of handing over her father's evidence. Or she could fight, using skills she'd hoped never to need, and try to keep innocent people from paying the price for her father's war. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. She loaded the weapon, checked her ammunition, and prepared to show Prague exactly what kind of person had been cutting their hair for 2 years. The quiet barber was about to become someone else entirely.
The first gunshot shattered the morning stillness, followed immediately by screaming from the street. Through the barbershop window, Aspen could see people running, some dropping to the ground, others diving behind parked cars. A woman she recognized from the local cafe was crouched behind a mailbox, her face white with terror. Her phone rang again. Krejci. "Aspen, shots fired in your area. Our units are still 5 minutes out. Whatever you do, don't engage. These aren't ordinary criminals." But Aspen was already beyond ordinary considerations. She'd seen the tactical positioning, counted at least 6 armed figures, and recognized the professional coordination of a military-style operation. These weren't just assassins sent to kill her. They were a full elimination team prepared to leave no witnesses. "Detective," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos outside. "How many innocent people are you willing to let die to bring me in for questioning?" "That's not because that's what's happening right now. While your units are stuck in traffic, people who never did anything wrong are about to pay for my father's choices." She ended the call and switched off the phone. Whatever happened next, she needed to do it without official interference or well-meaning attempts to negotiate with people who'd already decided that civilian casualties were acceptable losses. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, its weight and balance exactly what muscle memory expected. She'd maintained these skills in secret for 2 years, hoping never to need them, but her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Preparation without purpose is just fear, Aspodia. But when purpose calls, preparation becomes survival." Through the shop's front window, she could see the tactical situation developing. The explosion at Victor's electronics shop had been a distraction, drawing local police to the wrong location while the real assault team moved into position. Snipers controlled the high ground, assault teams blocked the street exits, and someone with professional military training was coordinating the entire operation. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed she was just a frightened woman with information, not someone who'd inherited her father's expertise along with his enemies. Mrs. Svoboda appeared at her bakery window, trying to see what was happening, completely unaware that a sniper had her in his sightline. In 30 seconds, when the assault team received confirmation that civilians were secured, that window would become a killing field. Aspen made her choice. Moving with fluid precision, she positioned herself behind the barber chair, using its heavy base for cover while maintaining sight lines through both windows. The angle was perfect. She could see the sniper's position across the street, the assault team's coordination point near the grocery store, and the evacuation route civilians would need to survive what was coming.
The first shot she fired wasn't aimed at the sniper. It was a warning shot, deliberately placed to shatter the bakery window and send Mrs. Svoboda diving to safety. The message was clear to anyone with military training. Someone in the barbershop was armed, skilled, and prepared to fight. The response was immediate and professional. The sniper adjusted his position to target her location, while the assault team began to move to flank the shop from multiple angles. Radio chatter filled the air as they realized their intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Her second shot removed the sniper from the equation permanently. The sound of the rifle in the confined space of the barbershop was deafening, but Aspen's training kicked in automatically. Acquire target, control breathing, squeeze trigger, assess result, acquire next target. The muscle memory her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why she needed to know these things. Movement near František's store. Two figures in tactical gear attempting to use civilians as human shields. This was exactly what she'd feared, what had forced her hand. These people weren't just trying to kill her, they were prepared to massacre neighbors to accomplish their mission. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Krejci's number again. She answered it without taking her eyes off the street. "Jesus Christ, Aspen, what are you doing?" "My job," she replied, tracking another target through her scope. "The job you said I wasn't qualified for?" "This isn't your job. You're a barber." "No, detective. I'm Milos Radovich's daughter. I'm the person he trained to survive exactly this situation. And right now, I'm the only thing standing between these professionals and a neighborhood of innocent people. Your units are almost there. Your units are equipped to handle domestic criminals, not international assassination teams with military-grade weapons and tactical training. By the time they establish a perimeter and call for specialized support, everyone on this block will be dead." Another movement, another target acquired, another threat eliminated with mechanical precision. "This is who I am, detective. This is what I was trained for, and right now, it's exactly what this situation requires." The transformation was complete. The quiet barber was gone, and in her place stood someone who could disassemble threats as efficiently as she'd once disassembled weapons.
Detective Krejci's voice crackled through the phone with a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. Aspodija, whatever your name is, you need to stop firing and take cover. You're making this worse." "Worse for whom?" she replied, tracking movement near the grocery store where František was still pinned down behind an overturned produce cart. "The assassination team were the civilians they're using for target practice." Through her scope, she could see the tactical situation evolving rapidly. The remaining members of the assault team had realized they were facing someone with professional military training, not a terrified refugee with a lucky shot. Their movements became more cautious, more coordinated, more dangerous to the civilians caught in the crossfire. "Listen to me," Krejci continued, his voice strained. "Our tactical units are 2 minutes out. When they arrive, they need to know who's a threat and who isn't. Right now, you're an armed individual in the middle of a combat zone. That makes you a target for our people as much as theirs." Aspen adjusted her position, using the shop's multiple mirrors to monitor approaches from different angles, a trick that worked as well for combat as it did for cutting hair. "Then you better make sure your people understand the situation before they arrive." "What situation? All they're going to see is multiple shooters and civilian casualties." "The situation," Aspen said, her voice hardening, "is that a team of international assassins came to my neighborhood to kill me and anyone who might have witnessed their presence. The situation is that I'm preventing that from happening." Her fourth shot disabled a vehicle that was attempting to ram through the police barricades that had finally appeared at the end of the street. The precision of the shot,
targeting the engine block rather than the driver, demonstrated exactly the kind of controlled violence that separated professionals from amateurs. "How do I know you're not one of them?" Krejci demanded. "How do I know this isn't some kind of gang war or arms-dealing dispute? For all I know, you're exactly what they said, a weapons trafficker like your father." The accusation hit harder than the bullets that were occasionally shattering glass around her. For 2 years, she'd tried to build a life separate from her father's choices, separate from the violence that had defined her childhood. Now she was being forced to embrace those very skills to protect people who'd never trusted her anyway. "You want to know what my father really was?" Aspen said, taking aim at an assault team member who was using Mrs. Svoboda's bakery for cover. "He was a gunsmith who got caught between warring factions and tried to protect his community, just like I'm doing right now." "By killing people? By stopping people who came here to commit mass murder?" Her fifth shot sent the gunman diving away from the bakery, protecting the building where she knew Mrs. Svoboda was hiding. "Your investigation files should tell you that my father's war crimes were supplying weapons to village defense forces, not paramilitary death squads." Through the phone, she could hear sirens getting closer, radio chatter and Czech that suggested the police tactical units were finally approaching. But she could also see that the assassination team was preparing for exactly this development. They were positioning for a final assault that would eliminate both her and any witnesses before official reinforcements could intervene effectively. "Detective, in about 30 seconds, the remaining members of this team are going to attempt to breach this shop. When that happens, they're going to discover that I have information worth killing dozens of people to suppress. Information that my father died to protect." "What kind of information?" "The kind that my father died to protect. Names, dates, financial records of a weapons trafficking network that reaches into law enforcement agencies across 3 countries. I paused to track movement near the side entrance of my shop. "Including agencies that might have advanced knowledge of when and where a witness might be found." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Krejci's investigation might have been compromised from the beginning, his surveillance of her used by the very people they were trying to catch. "That's impossible," Krejci said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "Is it? How else did they know exactly when to find me, exactly where I'd be, exactly how to coordinate an assault that bypassed your security measures?" Movement at the shop's rear entrance. 2 figures preparing to breach. Aspen shifted position to cover both approaches simultaneously. "Detective, your tactical teams need to understand something very important when they arrive. The woman shooting from this barbershop isn't the threat they need to neutralize. She's the only reason any of the civilians in this neighborhood are still alive." "And after this is over?" Krejci asked. "After the shooting stops and the bodies are counted and the reports are filed?" Aspen smiled grimly, her finger steady on the trigger as she prepared for the final assault. "After this is over, Detective, everyone's going to know exactly what this barber is capable of." The breach came simultaneously from 3 directions: front door, rear entrance, and the skylight above that Aspen had never noticed being compromised. These weren't ordinary criminals. They moved with the precision of Special Forces operators, coordinating their assault with military efficiency. But Aspen had spent 2 years unconsciously preparing for exactly this moment, and the barbershop had become an extension of her tactical awareness. Every mirror showed her angles of approach. Every piece of furniture provided potential cover. Every tool within reach could become a weapon in hands trained from childhood to turn everyday objects lethal. The first attacker through the front door expected to find a terrified woman hiding behind the counter.
Instead, he found himself facing someone who moved like liquid violence, someone whose muscle memory had been programmed by years of her father's relentless training. Aspen's combat reflexes took over completely. The careful, quiet Barber disappeared, replaced by someone who could process tactical information faster than conscious thought. Distance, angles, timing, threat assessment, all calculated in microseconds while her body moved with deadly precision. Her rifle barked twice, and the front entrance was clear. The rear breach team tried to use flashbang grenades to disorient her, but Aspen had closed her eyes and covered her ears the instant she heard the distinctive metallic sound of the pins being pulled. When the blast faded, she was already moving, using the shop's layout to create fatal funnels that turned the attackers' tactical advantages into death traps. Through it all, her phone remained connected to Detective Krejci, who was listening to the most intense firefight Prague had experienced since World War II, taking place in a neighborhood barbershop. "Jesus Christ," she heard him whisper. "How many are there?" "7 initially," Aspen replied, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos around her. 3 down, 4 remaining. They're regrouping for another push. Our tactical units are 30 seconds out. Tell them to secure the perimeter and protect the civilians. Don't let anyone else into this shop until I'm done." Done with what? With proving that some skills are worth more than the people who taught them. The skylight attacker had been patient, waiting for the ground assault to draw her attention before rappelling down from above. But Aspen had learned long ago that in close-quarters combat, awareness was more important than armor. She sensed the movement above her and rolled sideways just as automatic weapons fire stitched across the spot where she'd been standing. Her return fire was precise and final. The remaining 3 attackers made their mistake by assuming she was trapped. They coordinated a final assault, coming through the front and rear simultaneously while maintaining suppressive fire to keep her pinned down. It was textbook small unit tactics, the kind of maneuver that had been proven effective in countless military operations. But textbook tactics assumed you were fighting someone who thought like a soldier. Aspen thought like a craftsperson, someone who understood that precision trumped power, that efficiency mattered more than overwhelming force. She did something that no military manual would recommend. She stood up in the middle of the firefight and walked calmly to the center of the shop. For a moment that felt frozen in time, all movement stopped. The attackers, trained to expect cover-based warfare, were stunned by the sheer audacity of someone willing to stand exposed in the middle of a gun battle. Their tactical training hadn't prepared them for an opponent who moved with such complete confidence in her own abilities. In that moment of surprise, Aspen did something that would be talked about in law enforcement circles for years to come. She disassembled her rifle. Not the slow, careful disassembly of someone maintaining equipment, but the lightning-fast field strip of someone who could perform the operation blindfolded. Stock detached, barrel removed, bolt carrier group extracted, all while standing in the open, all while under fire from multiple directions. The attackers, confused by what appeared to be surrender or breakdown, hesitated for the crucial seconds it took her to prove why her father had been legendary in certain circles. She reassembled the weapon in 4.2 seconds. 4.2 seconds to transform scattered components into a functional combat rifle. 4.2 seconds that demonstrated why Milos Radovich's daughter had been worth hunting across 3 countries and 2 years of careful hiding. The final 3 attackers didn't survive long enough to report what they had witnessed. When the tactical units finally breached the shop,
They found Aspen sitting calmly in her barber chair, the disassembled rifle arranged neatly on her workstation, like the tools of her trade. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, and her green eyes held the kind of calm that comes only from absolute certainty about who you are and what you're capable of. "Detective Krejci," she said into the phone that was still connected, "you can tell your Europol friend that I'm ready to discuss those files now. But we're going to have a very different conversation than the one she originally planned." The point of no return had been crossed. The quiet barber was gone forever.
The aftermath of the firefight brought chaos that even Prague's experienced emergency services struggled to manage. 7 bodies, a destroyed barbershop, shattered windows throughout the neighborhood, and dozens of witnesses who would spend months trying to reconcile the quiet woman who cut their hair with the lethal operator they just witnessed in action. Detective Krejci arrived as paramedics were treating Mrs. Svoboda for shock, and Victor was giving his statement to forensics teams. The electronics repair shop owner kept shaking his head and repeating, "She knew exactly where to shoot. Every shot was precise. How does a barber know how to do that?" Aspen sat in the back of an ambulance, submitting to medical examination while maintaining constant visual contact with the evidence teams processing her shop. They were bagging her tools, photographing bullet trajectories, documenting a crime scene that told a story most of them couldn't fully comprehend. "The rifle components," she told Krejci when he approached. "Your forensics people need to understand that what they're looking at isn't just weapon maintenance, it's performance art." Performance art? 4.2 seconds to field strip and reassemble a combat rifle under fire. That's not something you learn casually. That's something you perfect through thousands of hours of practice, starting when you're young enough that your hands haven't developed muscle memory for anything else. Agent Mueller arrived in a convoy of black vehicles that drew curious stares from neighbors who'd already had more excitement than their quiet district typically saw in a decade. She surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to cleaning up international incidents. "Ms. Radovich," she said, approaching the ambulance, "we need to discuss the immediate future. First, we need to discuss how an international assassination team knew exactly when and where to find me, despite the fact that your investigation was supposedly classified." Mueller's expression didn't change, but Krejci's did. The detective looked between them with growing understanding of the implications he'd been too focused on the immediate crisis to consider. "You think there's a leak in the investigation?" he asked. "I think," Aspen said carefully, "that the timing of this attack, combined with the professional quality of the team, suggests that someone with access to official information wanted me dead before I could share what my father told me." The medical technician finished his examination and declared her fit for questioning, though he recommended psychological evaluation given the trauma she'd experienced. Aspen almost smiled at that. The trauma wasn't surviving the firefight, it was realizing that the peaceful life she'd built was impossible to maintain. "The files," Mueller said without preamble. "Your father's evidence. Where is it?" "Safe, but not accessible until I'm certain that sharing it won't result in more assassination attempts." "That's not how this works. You're not in a position to negotiate terms." "Agent Mueller," Aspen said, standing up from the ambulance and facing the Europol officer directly. 7 professional killers just tried to murder me in broad daylight on a public street. They knew my location, my routines, and the exact timing of your investigation. That suggests either your security is catastrophically compromised or someone within your organization wanted me silenced. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation, and until I understand which officials I can trust, my father's evidence stays exactly where it is." The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of František, who approached them with the careful politeness of someone who just watched his neighborhood barber eliminate a team of armed professionals. "Excuse me," he said to Aspen. "I wanted to thank you. That man, the one with the automatic rifle, he was using my customers as human shields. If you hadn't—" He gestured helplessly at the scene around them. "If I hadn't what, František?" "If you hadn't been exactly who you really are,
instead of who we thought you were," he said simply. "Mrs. Svoboda could have been killed. My grandson was supposed to visit today. If those men had come an hour later—" Agent Mueller watched this exchange with visible calculation. The narrative she'd planned, dangerous fugitive harbored information that justified extreme measures, was being complicated by the reality and civilian witnesses who'd seen Aspen risking her life to protect them. "Ms. Radovich," Mueller said finally, "perhaps we can find a compromise. Temporary protective custody while we verify the security of our investigation. Full debriefing of your father's information in exchange for witness protection and legitimate legal status. And if I discover that someone in your organization set up today's attack, then we deal with that problem when we confirm it exists." Aspen looked around at the neighborhood she'd called home for 2 years, damaged now, forever changed by the violence that had followed her from her father's past. Mrs. Svoboda was crying as she gave her statement. Victor was staring at his destroyed shop. The children who usually played in the courtyard were nowhere to be seen. "Detective Krejci, I want your word that these people will be protected. Whatever happens next, whatever my father's files contain, the residents of this neighborhood don't deserve to pay for choices made during a war that ended before some of them were born." "You have my word," Krejci replied without hesitation. It was a beginning, though Aspen suspected it was also the end of any hope for the normal life she'd briefly believed might be possible.
6 months after the firefight that destroyed her barbershop, Aspen Roberts, now officially Gospodija Radovich again, stood in a conference room at Europol headquarters in The Hague, watching as the final pieces of her father's evidence were presented to an international tribunal. The files she'd carried for 3 years, hidden in a safety deposit box in Vienna, under an identity even she had almost forgotten, contained more than weapons trafficking records. They documented a network of corruption that reached into law enforcement agencies, defense ministries, and international peacekeeping organizations across Eastern Europe. Agent Mueller's investigation had been compromised from the beginning, just as Aspen had suspected. The leak came from within Europol itself, an administrative assistant whose gambling debts had made her vulnerable to the same criminal network her organization was investigating. The assistant had provided the assassins with Aspen's location, her routines, and the timing of the official approach that was meant to bring her in safely. The Prague incident, as it had become known in official reports, had exposed systematic corruption that went far beyond her father's original case. 17 officials across 6 countries were facing charges, and the weapons trafficking network had been dismantled completely. Detective Krejci attended the final hearing, having been promoted to head Prague's organized crime division, partly based on his handling of the international incident that had begun in his district. He found Aspen during a recess, looking out at The Hague's government buildings through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About which part? Hiding for 3 years, or finally stopping?" "About the barbershop. About the life you built in Prague." Aspen considered this. The neighborhood had recovered, slowly. Victor had rebuilt his electronics shop, Mrs. Svoboda still ran her bakery, and František's grocery store served the same customers who had witnessed the most intense firefight in Prague's recent history. But they looked at the empty building where precision cuts had been, with a mixture of loss and bewilderment. "I was good at cutting hair," she said finally. "Better than I expected to be. There was something peaceful about making people look exactly how they wanted to look, about creating small moments of satisfaction in their daily lives. But I was better at the other thing, the thing my father taught me. And when it mattered, when people's lives depended on skills I'd spent years trying to suppress, being good at cutting hair wasn't enough." The tribunal reconvened, and Aspen returned to her seat in the witness section. Over the past 6 months, she'd testified in 12 different proceedings, always with the same precision she'd once brought to trimming hair. Names, Dates, financial transactions, weapon specifications, all delivered with mechanical accuracy that left no room for doubt or interpretation. The presiding judge delivered the final verdicts, guilty on all counts for the surviving members of the trafficking network, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment. The case was officially closed, the network dismantled, and Aspen Roberts was free to build whatever life she chose. After the proceedings ended, Agent Mueller approached her in the corridor outside the courtroom. "So, what's next? Witness protection? New identity? We can arrange placement anywhere in the European Union." "Actually, I've been thinking about consulting work." "What kind of consulting?" "The kind where law enforcement agencies need someone who understands both sides of international weapons trafficking. Someone who can think like the people you're trying to catch because she was trained by someone who knew exactly how those networks operated." Mueller raised an eyebrow. "You want to work with us?" "I want to make sure that what happened in Prague never happens again. That the next person who has information worth killing for doesn't have to spend 3 years hiding in a barbershop, hoping that keeping quiet will keep innocent people safe." Detective Kretschy, who had been listening to their conversation, smiled. "The neighborhood still talks about you, you know. Not just about the shooting, but about how you protected them. Mrs. Swoboda says you're welcome back anytime. And I told her that Prague would be lucky to have you back in whatever capacity you choose." 3 months later, Aspen Roberts opened a new office in Prague's financial district. The sign on the door read, "Radovic Security Consulting, Specialized Risk Assessment." Her clients included law enforcement agencies, private security firms, and occasionally individuals who found themselves in situations that required very specific kinds of expertise. She kept regular hours, maintained professional relationships with her colleagues, and lived a life that was both legitimate and satisfying. But in her desk drawer, she kept a set of precision tools that had nothing to do with corporate security consulting. Because some skills, once perfected, should never be allowed to rust. And everyone who worked with her knew that if the situation ever required it, the woman who could assemble a combat rifle in under 5 seconds was ready to prove that some talents transcend whatever profession happens to pay the bills.